I think of film as documentary film. I think documentary is what film is. When a camera takes a picture, it makes a document of reality. When an audio recorder goes on, it records a document of reality. It's possible that you can add things to that document. You could add an element of fiction, and then film becomes something else, it becomes a fiction film. But I think of film, the zero degree of film, the way that Roland Barthes talks about the zero degree of writing, uh, is documentary. You have to do something to make it other than documentary. And I think it would be better, it would be clearer if our languages indicated that the modifier in front of film should be fiction. So we should speak of film, which is inherently documentary, and then we could speak of fiction film, which is a special kind of film. Well, I love fiction film, and I just never thought that um, it was something that I could do or wanted to do. In order to be a fiction filmmaker, I think you really should be a writer, because the film should originate with the person who's making it. Uh, I certainly could be a director. Uh, I could have learned to do that because I directed in theater when I was a student, and I loved theater. And fiction film has something in common with theater. It's still directing actors. But the origin of my interest in documentary goes back to my childhood in a lot of ways. I did what a lot of people do and a lot of children do, which is they have a camera and they try to make records of their lives, of the family, the people around them, of what's happening to them. They want to keep it and hold on to it. And as it happened, my father had a photography business, so I knew about photography, and the house had cameras in it. So it was an easy path for me to take. And then also when I was a child, it was the early days of television, and American television had a couple of things in it that really interested me in documentary. One was a program that came on Saturday mornings called Industry on Parade, and those were documentaries about the insides of factories and how objects were made inside factories in an industrial way. And I found that absolutely amazing and fascinating. And as it turns out, it's gotten more and more difficult to make that kind of film because the corporations that run factories are more and more reluctant to let people in. But in the 1950s, they were proud of it, and it made it an exciting kind of revelation for a child to see things, to see work being done on an industrial scale and to see how objects and cars and other things were made. And then also, there was a very influential series for me run by the NBC network. They had a huge amount of money in those days, and they spent it on making a documentary film series about the Pacific War against Japan, the naval war. It was called Victory at Sea, and it had many episodes. I think it ran for a whole year, and it was half an hour a week, and it was a high prestige enterprise for them. They commissioned Richard Rodgers, the same person who wrote, Oklahoma and South Pacific, to write an orchestral score for it. It was recorded by the NBC Symphony, and all of the image track was made up of archival footage. And I thought it was, now that's more common. It's more common, but it's not so common to spend that amount of resources and money on it. But it was very impressive for me as a child to see history sort of shown to me directly before my eyes. I think when I was in college, it was the very beginning of cinema verite, and I saw several of the early cinema verite films in college, and I thought, oh, that's really exciting. You not only can see what was happening in the way that Victory at Sea showed that through all of the archival footage, but now you can really hear people talking too. So that seemed to open a door, and I think that's what really interested me. Well, I think I came of age at a time when politics was really being talked about a lot. This was the late 60s, the early 70s, and one of the things that was said was, it was almost a catchphrase, that the personal is the political. And it came out of a period of intense political unrest. I mean, it happened in Europe as well as the United States. In the United States, it was connected to the Vietnam War. And that gave way to a second chapter in which feminism arose. And with feminism, the idea arose that the personal and the political were really intertwined. So my first very big projects, or especially the film Family Portrait Sittings, came out of a kind of political question or political motive. It's a personal film, and it's an autobiographical film, but it had, the motivation was political. It was specifically, it was one incident, all of everybody I knew, all students, I was a student, I was a graduate student, were all militantly against the Vietnam War. We demonstrated, we wrote letters, there was a lot of activism against the Vietnam War. And one night I was talking to my grandfather's brother, it was my great uncle, who was a kind of patriarch in the family. And they never really talked seriously to children. I mean, we were paid attention to in the family, but it was the first conversation in which he really asked my views about something and acknowledged that I maybe was a grown person. And we talked about the Vietnam War, and the shocking thing was, to me, that his views were exactly the same as mine, and for exactly the same reasons. And he was a man who had 5 years of education total in a small village in central Italy before he immigrated to the United States after World War I. And I started to ask myself after that, where do these ideas come from? And I mean, I knew in a sense they came from his life as a tailor working in factories, working in union shops, being a union member, being a delegate of the union, being a shop foreman for the union. So, I mean, I knew it in a kind of narrative way, but I never really started to say to myself, oh, my family actually is as much in history as anything. So I started to make, and I made an autobiographical film in order to explore that question. How could I really understand my family as a totality, including the way in which history had shaped them and shaped their ideas. So I see that relationship as that border is very permeable between the autobiographical and the political. Well, of course, everybody can photograph everything now, and that means that everything can be made visible to society. So the camera has assumed more power in a way. There's all kinds of things that people would rather be hidden can't be easily hidden anymore, and we've seen this all over the world, including places where life is very controlled, such as Iran. And that's a huge difference. The other huge difference is that anybody, given the access to technology, anybody can make a film in the same way that anybody can write a book. It was always true that everybody could write a book. All you needed by way of infrastructure was a pencil and a piece of paper, and you could write a book. And now something like that is true with film, but it's very complex because suddenly there are a huge number of films in the world, just an overwhelming number of films. Films take place in real time. Audiences have to sit there and see them. So the question has, in a way, shifted from, should a film be produced? Can it get money to be produced? Can this film come into being because it's an object of great expense? It's shifted from that kind of question to the question of the gatekeepers, those who look at finished films and decide which ones should be let through the gate, whatever the gate is. It used to be almost exclusively film festivals when I started making films. That was the gate to distribution and to other things. And now there are multiple gates. Some of them without gatekeepers. Some of them are the internet, and they have no gatekeepers. But finding things in the midst of that, in other words, putting the burden of the viewer putting the burden on the viewer of being a gatekeeper and finding what films are significant and look at is really formidable. So I think we live in an age of, it's a sort of avalanche of films of all kinds, and an avalanche of documentary films. It's very difficult, and it has economic consequences too, where people who make documentary films for their life have, that's what they do as professions, have more struggle getting uh, adequate financing. It's because the financing is spread over so many people. It's a time of great change. Whether this situation will continue as is, how it will evolve, I have no idea. Um, for sure, there's a spectrum, there's a continuity, and on one end of the spectrum is the documentary, and the other end of the spectrum is the fiction. And since I think of the documentary as the 0 degree, the question about what is documentary and what is fiction for me has to do with how much fiction is added to the original documentary element. Uh, if film left to itself, that is, what comes out of the camera is by its nature documentary, and of course, that's only what comes out of the camera. Of course, it has to be construed. So any kind of construction of it, the selection to take this picture instead of another picture, the idea of finding a narrative in ordinary chaotic material, all of those are connected to the idea of fiction in some remote way. So there isn't any such thing as a completely pure documentary film. Even surveillance footage isn't really pure. So it's both ends of the spectrum are contaminated with the other end of the spectrum. So if the question, documentary versus fiction, presupposes the idea of purity, I want to say there isn't any purity. There's all mixed. Everything is all mixed. And the question is, where is the line that you draw? Because people do draw a line and say, this isn't a documentary, this is fiction, or this isn't fiction, it's documentary. And how you draw that line, for me, the first important thing is what some film theorists have called indexing. The filmmaker indexes a film by saying, this is what it is. This is an experimental film. This is a fiction film. This is a documentary film. And that indexing is important. But it's not the end of the story. The viewer also indexes. The viewer hears that from the filmmaker and might well say, like all human communications, this could be false. It could be a lie. It could be not a lie, but a mistake. It could be a deception. So there's a transaction between the filmmaker and the viewer that has to do with the indexing of a film. And different viewers would put it in different at different places. Also in different eras, the lines come in different places. Nonetheless, in our real world conversation about things, our ordinary use of the words, documentary does mean something and fiction does mean something. What it means is a set of expectations. So in cases where we're deceived, where we thought something was one and it's actually the other, the reason it's disconcerting is that we have one set of expectations. And if those expectations turn out to be false in some ways, we reevaluate what we thought in light of the indexing that we've inferred afterwards. So it's a complicated transaction. Often it's not an issue because the work lies firmly in one territory or the other. But as everybody has always pointed out, fiction is full of documentary elements. I might go as a viewer with a documentary agenda to see a film that stars Marlon Brando because I want to see, I'm interested not only in his performance, but how he has aged, what the mark of time has left on his face or in his posture. And those are documentary elements because it is Marlon Brando really there, and his picture has really been taken. And it's different from other kinds of fiction, like Marlon Brando plays Hamlet. Well, Hamlet is not embodied, so you don't go to see Hamlet, you go to see the embodiment of Hamlet. So it's in that way that fiction film is really bound to the idea of documentary, and the idea of documentary is bound to the agenda of the viewer as well as the filmmaker. Well, I think there's some things that we just, in the middle of living through a period, we can't see clearly. Um, there's been a tremendous renaissance in documentary film, and everybody has noted that. But to try to figure out what the real reason for it is, I think it will be clearer later. But some of the reason I see is that the idea of news and of journalism has shifted so that, and lots of people have remarked on this. One element is that the news cycle is very short now. It used to be that the news cycle was at least one day long because newspapers were only published once a day, and it took a fair amount of time to get information from the reporter to the newspaper. So journalism has become much more rapid. Journalism has also become much more, I don't know what, of one voice, because ideas, there are ever a smaller number of reporters, and ever, as the days go on, more circulation of the same ideas, the same stories from one media outlet to the other. So there's a tremendous redundancy as well as rapidity in the media. Documentary film sets itself off in several ways from that. A very, very important way is that traditionally, and this I think is more true in Europe than in the United States, documentary film is looked at as authored. Um, Journalism, of course, there's a byline, but when I read the New York Times this morning, I do recognize the names of reporters, but I'm reading the New York Times. That is, it's the institution that's reporting the news to me. And the institution vets those reporters. It says, we have decided these people are professionally very good, their work is to be trusted, and I trust them as a reader because I have some relationship with the journalistic outlet that they're writing for. I also have ideas about what that outlet represents, about what its politics are, what it tends to favor, what tends to disfavor, so I can put a frame around what I'm hearing and what I'm reading. Documentary film, I think, is really different from that. For one thing, it has an author, and the author takes responsibility for the viewpoint on the subject. The author could be following journalistic rules, could be more like a journalist, or could be more like an essayist. But when I go to a documentary film, I commit myself to an author's view of a subject, and often a view that's taken a fairly long time to develop.